Hi, and welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and video show which brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, and experience from hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. If you're new to the channel, please subscribe so you won't miss a new episode. I'm your host, Frits Bussemaker, and today I'm delighted and privileged to have a conversation with Filippo Ongaro. Filippo, welcome to the program.
Good morning, Fritz.
Now, Filippo, I realize that you are a well-known name, high name recognition in the Italian part of this world. For those people who don't have an Italian background, I'm going to give you brief background to the audience. You're educated as a doctor. You live in beautiful Lugano in the Italian Alps. Once you became a doctor, you became a flight surgeon with ESA, the European Space Agency. When you left ESA, you actually started your own career as an entrepreneur, medical doctor with an anti-aging firm, founder and CEO of InnoForce, and currently founder and CEO of Metodo Ongaro. And you've written a number of books on health and food, and you also have a regular podcast in Italian on health. Again, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much for having me.
That in itself should make people quite curious. Flight surgeon for a European Space Agency, YouTube's videos. Don't know where to start, so I'm going to start at the beginning. First of all, what made you become a doctor?
Well, that's an interesting actually question because I became a doctor because I loved sports in reality. So when I was 14, 15, I got hooked up with all the fitness movement, the bodybuilding movement, the big actors of the 80s. It was a time in which big muscles seemed to be, the solution to everything. So I was a young kid and I loved that and I started to train. And when I started to train, luckily I grew up at least partly in England, so I was very familiar with reading in English, and I could have access to a lot of those magazines that were not found in Italy. Like Muscle and Fitness, all those magazines that were speaking about how to build your body, so how you have to eat, how you should train, which supplements you should take, and I was somehow shocked by the amount of information that was available. So that was the beginning, and I started to train seriously, but I understood when I was about 18, 19 that I didn't have the genetics to become an elite athlete. So I started to wonder, well, what can I do with this knowledge that I built up? Which type of, of study would allow me to exploit this initial passion? And I said, well, okay, there are two things, sports science or medicine. And I said, well, maybe medicine gives more options. And that's how it all started. Then I got very much into the clinical dimension in reality for a few years when I studied medicine, because I was working also as a volunteer, to help nurses and stuff like that. So I got, again, a little bit shocked about how a hospital really works and how it's all about, adjusting people that have lost health, but there's very little to do in terms of promoting health, promoting performance, promoting well-being. And so towards the end of my study, I said, okay, I have to go back to sports and I'm going to do sports medicine. So when I ended the university, I got my medical doctor degree. Then I went into sports medicine studies. And then from there, almost by chance, because I asked to go for a 6-month research period in Germany. There's a very big sports university there, the Deutsche Sporthochschule in Köln. And the professor that I was assigned to was working with ESA. And so I got exposed to this world of astronauts. I understood that one of the biggest challenges that actually astronauts had at the beginning of the International Space Station area, so, long-term flights, was how to prevent muscle and bone loss, which was very much similar to what I knew very well, how you build muscle, how you build, strength and performance. And so that's how it all started. For the passion for training became in reality my job, let's say.
I got that. So I didn't make that link, but it's obvious now you say it like that. So it's basically the whole bodybuilding background, bring that to space so people in space maintain their body functions.
Exactly, because once again, one of the biggest problems in long-term space flight is accelerated aging. So 6 months in space, if you don't set up a countermeasure program, okay, to prevent what happens, 6 months in space are more or less like 10 years on Earth in terms of aging of the body. And one of the main factors that actually triggers this aging process is muscle loss. Okay, and muscle loss is due to the fact that in the absence of gravity, you really don't need muscles. So, you know, the body is not investing energy in a tissue that is not useful.
Okay, so does exercise then in space counterbalance the degradation of the muscle? Can you fully compensate it?
It does very well. Well, I wouldn't say fully 100%, but it does very well. Obviously, one of the main factors is which type of equipment do you have available in space. So for many years, for example, something that you cannot do weightlifting in the absence of weight, obviously. Yeah. So how do you substitute that resistance was a very big problem. So for many years, you know, they were just using elastic bands and very simple stuff. Now on the International Space Station, there's a very complex machine that works with vacuum pumps and creates very strong resistance and allows to do all the basic exercises that you would do in a gym, like squat, you know, deadlifts, bench press, whatever. And that made absolutely a huge difference in the health of the crews.
Yeah, it makes sense. Again, does ask me bear me the question. So, if the body deteriorates so fast in space, what does that say if we want to travel to Mars, to planet? Is this something we can manage in your
we will be able to manage that for sure. I cannot say that at the moment we have all the tools to allow such a complex trip and very long trip, but I'm sure that they will come up. And the knowledge that has been built during these years on the International Space Station with long-term missions, is very useful for this. And that was exactly the original plan, you know, for how to use the ISS. So to build knowledge on very long term space missions. Mission to Mars has several other challenges, not only the how to preserve the health of crew members, but in medical terms, especially, you need to have a totally autonomous crew. On the space station, if an emergency comes up, the landing process is extremely fast. From Mars, obviously, that's not possible. So you need to have medical capacities on board that so far were not needed in space.
Now, how long were you at ESA?
For about almost 8 years.
Okay. Now, I mean, space is very exciting. We can talk the whole session on space, but I do want to bring it back to Earth, unfortunately, for those listeners. Sorry, we're going to go back to Earth. Now, the fact that you said, okay, you age quicker in space, is that the link also to what was then your next endeavor to start an organization about anti-aging?
Well, yes, absolutely, because I was lucky enough to spend, you know, a lot of time in the US, and I could witness the birth and the growth of the anti-aging movement, of the functional medicine movement, the longevity medicine movement. And, you know, I started to think, well, in reality, this is a true emergency for planet Earth, you know. The quality and the health of the aging population, so the quality of life and the health of the aging population is one of the biggest challenges we have in front of us, okay? Because life expectancy has already increased, but what has not increased at the same level is health expectancy, you know? So we live longer, but we live many years in a condition of bad health. So yeah, I said, well, the knowledge I built up during my time at ESA with astronauts can be very useful, you know, to help age better people on Earth. And I must say, you know, at the space agency, I also met my wife. My wife is a psychologist, and she was working on the stress management of crew members. So also that, you know, we started to think, okay, there's a psychological dimension, an emotional dimension, a physical dimension, and maybe that's an interesting thing for people, you know. And then something very linked to the name of your show, I started to think, well, wait a minute, how many people in the world of health promotion, anti-aging medicine, prevention have worked with astronauts? And the response was 0. So I said, okay, here's a unique selling proposition that I can really use, to brand myself as a former astronaut doctor and to gain credibility with people. And so that's how it started. But we did underestimate one thing. People were not ready. I'm speaking about 2008, 2009. And when we left ESA and we started this whole anti-aging thing, it was a little too early. So people were not really ready. And that's the reason why I started to write books. Because I said, okay, if I just open my office and wait for people to come in, nothing is going to happen. I need to go and get people. I need to start talking about these things, That's how it started.
Yeah, because does that mean so anti-aging? I mean, I can understand that when you do take it serious, but it's also in the domain of where people try to sell snake oil or not.
Oh yeah, absolutely. The human race has since ever, tried to stay young, strong, healthy, and most frequently without having to do any effort. Okay, so of course there are a lot of proposals that go in that direction. So I'm going to keep you healthy, but you don't have to exercise. I'm going to keep you lean, but you can eat whatever you want. Those are silly and dangerous propositions. What we have tried to always do is really bring in the element of science, which is also, a very strong element in the space business, because in space you don't want to risk anything. Reliability is more important than innovation in space.
Yeah.
So, and at the end, the basic things that you have to do to age better, we all know them. I mean, you have to eat a healthy diet, you have to exercise every day, you have to manage your stress. So those are the things. And yes, there can be some supplements, there can be some new drugs coming up, but they will never be able to substitute to this lifestyle change. So that's really the core of what we try to do with people. So we work, on habits, on how you change your habits. There's a lot of knowledge coming from neuroscience now about this, which I find very interesting. But yes, I agree. There are, tons of things that could give a different message. Yes.
Okay. As we're going to talk about health now, could you give a definition of health? When is a human healthy?
Well, this is another very interesting question. The WHO was founded through a definition of health in 1946, which is not only the absence of disease, but a full state of physical, psychological, social well-being. Well, it's interesting. Of course, I agree with that. Health is not only the absence of disease. We have to, though, recognize that most of practical medicine is still dealing with health and disease as if you don't have a disease, then it means that you're healthy. So there's already a little contradiction in how much this new definition of health was really applied in clinical medicine. But I will go even a step further. I think that the definition of health is very much linked to fitness. So, you're really healthy when you're fit to do whatever you desire to do. And of course, that's also a little bit of a trap, because if your only desire is to sit in front of the television,
if you want to be a couch potato and you're healthy enough to do that.
But Fritz, that's exactly the problem. I have the impression that a lot of people think, unfortunately, that they're still very healthy, but just because they reduce to so much the challenges in their life, that you don't even see if you're not healthy and you're not fit anymore. You don't climb stairs, you don't walk, you don't do exercise, you don't go in the mountains. You just sit in your car, sit on your sofa. Then you never realize, the loss of functional capability. So for me, health is keeping this functional capability as high as possible throughout the aging process.
But then again, I mean, it's a very extreme example, the couch potato. But if somebody truly, honestly states, I'm going to be as happy as I can by just doing that in my life, and I do not care what others think of what I could do and should do. For me, that's my ideal life situation. If that person, I would say, fundamentally desires, that's my life. Could you then still say that person is healthy from his or her perspective from what a desirable life is? Because
Well,
what you're stating now is,
it's a difficult question because of course there's freedom of choice. Of
yeah,
course, people can choose whatever they want. Okay. But in my experience as a physician, as a doctor, I say, okay, you have to be ready though to say exactly the same thing once you have diabetes, after you have a stroke, if you have a cancer. Are you willing to still say those things?
yeah,
Because this is, the problem is the human brain is engineered to look for immediate pleasure and not think very much about the long-term consequences. That's the way we are built. Okay, evolutionary, we're built like this. So of course the world is full of people that say, but I'm perfectly fine. I work with my head. I don't use my body to work. So, but the question is your body saying the same thing? Because again, evolutionary, we're not made for that. So you can think that it's okay to sit the whole day and you're perfectly happy with that. That's okay. But you don't know what's happening in your body while you're sitting there for 10, 15, 20, 30 years, And then the question is, are you really ready to cope with the consequences? If the answer is yes, okay, I'm nobody, I cannot judge you. That's okay. But you have to be ready to understand that the choices you're making today will have a consequence in the future. Okay. Having said this, I also want to be clear. It's not that if you exercise, you eat healthy, and you manage your stress, you don't die, you never get sick, and you're saved from everything. No, that's not the case. First of all, you need to start doing those things because you love them and not because you are, dreaming that they will save you. Because that's the difference between longevity based on the joy of living and longevity based on the fear of death. Emotionally, it's very different, So that's one thing. And then you have to also be prepared that things happen anyhow, but you are reducing the chances. So at least for certain diseases, we know with absolute certainty today that the impact of lifestyle is very high. It's not absolute, but it's very high. So we should start working at least on, what we can control.
and that also means don't go to the Botox and plastic surgery route. You may look younger, but you will not be younger.
Well, yeah, again, that's a personal choice.
Yeah.
I cannot judge, but yeah, for sure, that has only to do with the way you look, but it doesn't have anything to do with the way you function. So one thing doesn't substitute the other, let's say. Okay, so if you are going towards plastic surgery, aesthetic medicine, you have to be also smart enough to understand, okay, that's one thing, but it's not enough. I have to do something else as well.
Okay. Now, you mentioned that, okay, you start to write books to get your message across. What happened when you started to write those books?
What happened is that I started to build a community. So I understood two things at that time. The first one was that many people were reading the books and then booking an appointment with us in our medical center. But I also saw a different path, which was many people were reading the books to try to change things in their life without necessarily going through an expensive and complex, medical checkup. And so I started to nurture both areas, so doing as much as we could in our medical practice, but also starting to provide more things to this growing community, like, videos, like groups on social media. So anything, a blog. Our blog, has been very, very much read by the Italian public in these years. So that was a way to say, okay, well, not everybody is ready or has the economic capacity to go through a complex medical checkup, but maybe there are many people that are willing to say, well, instead of choosing, white bread, I'm going to choose whole grain bread. Instead of, I don't know, eating fat meat, I'm going to choose lean meat or fish or legumes or whatever. So that's, and then the books also allowed me to reach other platforms. So radio shows, TV shows, media would be calling me and saying, okay, we read the book, we're interested in, about your thoughts. And so that's how this community started to grow, let's say.
And Um, you touched upon me on a topic which I personally find fascinating. That is the whole topic of food. And you also written books on food.
Yeah.
Uh, I'm trying to categorize what. No, could you give a summary of what your advice is with respect to food? What type of food should we eat or avoid?
The first thing is we have to understand that we, in generally, as a society, we eat too many calories in comparison to what we burn. That's the first thing, okay? So if in the years you are seeing that you're gaining fat, it means in those years you are intaking more calories than what you're burning. Then that's one thing. Then there's the effect of food, let's say, on the epigenetics. So on the expression of genes, on the modulation of biochemical processes, on the modulation of hormonal processes. And that has not so much to do with calories, but more with the macronutrients that give those calories. And for sure, one of the biggest mistakes that people do around the world is too much sugar, okay? Too much sugar, especially when it comes from liquid forms, is pretty much a disaster, okay? Because you don't realize you're eating it. It doesn't give any sense of fullness. So you keep on drinking and eating sugary foods and drinks. That's really, really bad. At the second ranking, let's say, it's refined carbs. So white pasta, white bread, white rice, they should be substituted with whole grain versions and also reduced in quantity in respect, or better, modulated in quantities in respect to how much physical exercise you're doing. If you're doing a lot of physical exercise, you also need a high degree energetic food like carbs, okay? But again, if you're sitting your whole day in front of a computer, you're not going to use those carbs. They're going to induce fat accumulation. Refined carbs and the sugar have a very severe, very important action on insulin production. And, excess insulin in a body that is losing muscle. Muscle tissue has the biggest amount of insulin receptors. Mm-hmm. So when you lose muscle, insulin doesn't know where to go. Let's put it that way. And that's going to have a bad action on several other aspects of your health, okay? Then, of course, also bad fats, hydrogenated fats, too many saturated fats. They should not necessarily disappear, but be reduced and substituted with monosaturated fats like olive oil, for example, avocado, or polyunsaturated fats like fatty fishes, stuff like that. A lot of vegetables, of course, the more the better. That's not the same for fruit, because fruit is okay from the intake of vitamins and antioxidants, but it has a lot of sugar, and fructose is not an especially good sugar for our liver and our health, let's say. And then I am also very much in favor of being careful in not reducing too much protein intake, because once again, muscle needs protein. And if you are working out, but you are not getting the sufficient amount of proteins, the muscle will not respond. Especially there's a phenomenon called anabolic resistance with aging. So if we compare a specific load on the muscle and a specific amount of proteins, between a 60-year-old man and a 20-year-old man, the response is extremely high in the 20-year-old person. So while you age, you have to be careful not to lose too much protein from your diet, but maybe to choose the right sources. So more fish than meat, for example. Eggs are okay. Legumes are okay. So we have, a lot of choices in reality.
Okay. Now, I'm realizing I'm listening to somebody who has a medical background as a doctor, and you're describing quite a complex system, and the consequences of food. So, how do you convince people who don't have that medical background and would argue, well, this is too complex, it's too difficult for me, I'm just going to keep on doing what I'm doing? So, because that is, I understand what you're trying to do with Metodo Ongaro is getting people to change their habits, as far as I understand.
Yeah.
So how do you do that where you could say the system you're trying to change is quite complex, and people might say it's too much.
Definitely. But what we do is that we actually train health professionals, so doctors, nutritionists, personal trainers, physiotherapists. We all train them in what we call neurocoaching. So how to use the knowledge that today is available about, our neurobiology. So what is a habit, for example? A habit is a neurobiological adaptation. You can see a habit in your brain, okay?
Yeah.
Through a functional magnetic resonance, you see the habits you have, because the areas of your brain that have been trained more to do a certain behavior are actually growing, okay? Like a muscle. So we train health professionals to deal with this coaching process, which is making a step forward in respect to the classical approach, which is I'm going to tell you what to do.
Yeah.
Okay, but I'm not going to help you in how you're going to do it. So we are trying to close that gap and saying, okay, professionals know what to tell you based on your, personal analysis, biochemistry, genetics, whatever. But then there's nobody that helps you transit from the lifestyle you have today to the lifestyle you need. Well, that's what we do. But we do it through health professionals. So we don't do it by, bringing in somebody that doesn't have the scientific background to do it. But we add to that person that has the scientific background the methodology to help people change habits and lifestyles. So that's basically how we're facing that. Having said that, it is complex, but it can also be simplified. If we tell people, well, the first thing, rule number one, do one single thing. Start every single meal with vegetables. That's not easy. That's not difficult. I mean, it's pretty easy.
Yeah.
So you can simplify. Now, what I told you was a very quick summary, but in reality, you can break it down in tiny little steps and add one step after the other, waiting that the person has metabolized that step, has really changed it into a habit.
Now, what's the scientific background you base your advice on? So I assume that's a question you get asked every now and then. Okay, great advice, but how can you prove to me it's sound advice?
Well, it's pretty simple because we haven't invented anything. It's all published. So what we actually do is get the science that is published and read it, study it, and change that into a practical approach. So in reality, that's also a little bit of a difference with what you said at the beginning, also a lot of people in the field of longevity selling stuff that doesn't have a very strong validation. Well, if you notice, all those attempts are going to focus on, I have something that others don't have.
Yes.
Which is a secret. Now, in science, there are no secrets. Okay. If it's science, it's published and it's public. Okay. So I have always chosen a different path. I have always said to people, first of all, I'm not a scientist. I'm a medical doctor and I'm a practical person. So what I did at the space agency was take scientific literature and make it a service, a program, And the second thing I say to people is what I tell you, you can find by yourself very easily. Go on PubMed, learn how to use a few keywords and you'll find confirmation of what I'm telling you. And this is also why we're not telling anything that is very strange, to be honest, or specifically ours. Maybe it's the way we tell it that makes a little bit of a difference. But what we say, I believe, is pretty much what everyone is saying that has a scientific background. You won't hear somebody saying, hey, you know what? You have to cut your vegetables and eat French fries. I mean, nobody will say that today. So,
yeah, no, that's true. Now, how would you describe what is success in this case for you? Is that growing a company? Is that making people more healthier? How do you define that?
Well, I think there are several aspects. If I would have to say, first of all, I don't know if I'm successful. I never asked myself this question. I let others judge because I don't know. My standards also changed throughout my life. So So I also believe success is something that evolves with time. You change your mind on what it is. Maybe, for example, in financial terms, when you don't have money, success is I want to have money. When you have money, success is not that anymore. It has to be something else.
Yeah.
So for me, I think the highest degree of success is measured in how much impact I have. That's my personal scale of success. So for me, success is impact. If I can change the life of people, if I can make them open their eyes, realize something, that for me is success. And everything else, the company, the economics, has to be a little bit of a consequence of this.
Okay,
Not the other way around. So I'll bend my values in order to have more economic success. No, that's something I never did and I don't want to do. So
quick remark. Or quick question. You said, okay, my definition of success has changed over the years. Was that a gradual process, or was that more around milestones?
I think it was a little bit around milestones. So I was, because again, coming from sports, I was very much somebody that would define objectives, define a program to get there, measure the progress, measure if I got there, and but each time I got there, then I started to feel like everybody. That's nothing special, but to feel okay, but there's something else. There must be something else. I wasn't constantly imagining, as we all do, this level of new happiness that I would gain by reaching that point, and that was very elusive, because every time that happiness would fade away and you start thinking about something else. And that was a characteristic of my life for a few years. So I would almost say that I wasn't a very happy man at that time. I was pushing, but I was never stopping and reflecting on what I gained and how to really feel well with that thing. Then through, I think, a pretty long process of what I call inner work, so reflections, meditation, writing about my life and myself, and the help of my wife, as she is more advanced in this self-reflection business. And we maybe females are also, women are also a little more prone to that. I changed, and I started to feel much more satisfied of what I have, and the less desire for having more, for next step, what's the next step, what's the next step. And that's when I started to also re-elaborate my idea of success, which wasn't anymore simply growing in whatever terms, but was more how much impact, how much value do I bring. And I got pretty much obsessed with that, because actually the practical side of my work, besides managing the company, is working as a coach. I work with large groups, and I became really addicted to this idea of, every single interaction I have, I want to bring some value. And that's also one of the reasons why you become a little bit allergic to all the superficial chats, that you have with people, because you see that it's a waste of time. And they are mostly done to cover up the need for changing something, So yeah, that's how it evolved in time.
Okay, now last couple of questions, Filippo. Fascinating story. First of all, how congruent are you yourself? Are you your own best example? Is it practice what you preach?
I have to say this, I don't want to sound, arrogant, but 100%. So, but because it started the other way around for me. It started from myself.
Yeah.
So it couldn't be any other way. So yes, I'm speaking with you now. I just did 45 minutes of walking uphill in the mountains, and an hour and 15 minutes of weight training before starting this call. And that's my routine basically every day. Which doesn't mean that that's what everybody has to do, but just to say, yes, I am, but I'm also a person that enjoys a glass of wine with a friend and, a nice meal. I also found a balance in this, because I also want to enjoy, life, conversations, and friendship.
Okay. Final question. You mentioned at the beginning of our talk that you were inspired by the magazines you were able to read when living in the UK on bodybuilding. What are the sources of your inspiration? What have they been over time?
That's an interesting question. I could go on For a very long time. Well, first of all, I must say, the main inspiration that I had as a kid were Sylvester Stallone and Arnold Schwarzenegger. And strangely enough, I got to know both of them. Okay, which is, fascinating. I didn't do anything to get to know them, but it happened because of common friends, because I've ended up in the same place at the same time. So that's also something that speaks about, the magic of life, that things happen. You can't control everything. But so that's the beginning, so that was the source of strength, power, perseverance. So you cannot quit, you cannot give up. But then growing up, it also changed a little. So, I started to investigate more other type of heroes, like, biographies, Mandela, Mother Teresa, Gandhi, everything that I love people that had an impact. And so again, I get inspired by people that have changed things with words, which is very common because those that I just mentioned are heroes for, maybe 80% of the world's population. So I'm nothing special in that. But I love to see that people through thoughts and words can really make change happen. That is really something that inspires me, yes.
Okay, one additional final question. So how do you want the world to remember you? What kind of inspiration do you want to leave behind?
I have one mantra in my brain all the time, which is improving the world one life at a time. So I don't believe in collective revolutions. I believe in what I can do with you, with the next one. So that's how I want to be remembered, like somebody that, tried with every interaction to make the world health, well-being, and happiness. Because the ultimate goal of all of us, should be to find happiness.
Filippo, I want to thank you so much for sharing your story, what inspires you.
Thank you.
To help create a better and more healthier world. Again, thank you so much.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.